Welcome to our makeup session for week 2 on the overview of state and local government. Thank you for bearing with me with today's cancellation, but this also gives us a chance to see how this technology works for moving forward and our online lectures moving forward. Just to note, this will probably be slightly longer than normal lecture because we are kind of trying to encapsulate both the class discussion and the basics that we were going to go over as well. So when we talk about the states, especially when we talk about the states with students who primarily have been exposed to federal concepts, it's important to think about the states in their context as entities within and as opposed to sometimes the federal government. So we need to talk about federalism. Federalism, briefly, and this is going to be a review for those of you who have had me for 120 or 310, is the idea that multiple sources of authority and multiple governments can exist. That spheres of responsibility can coexist where there is interaction at times and sometimes a very clear delineation of who does what. And quite simply, we have it because the power that states had at the time of our founding. Much of what we'll be talking about today is a consequence of the fact that states had a great deal of power at the time of our founding. And one of the biggest concerns about instituting our Constitution was the role that states would continue to play, if any, in this new government. But federalism can cause a lot of problems, and it can cause a lot of differences among states, which is how we'll be summing up this conversation at the end, talking about the ways in which states are so different from one another based on a variety of factors. So we can think of federalism in two distinct ways, and then there are variations in between. How we typically think of federalism, and probably how you were taught to think of federalism, is what you see on the left, or what political scientists will sometimes call layer cake federalism. The idea is that government is stacked upon each other, and that there's a buffer in between. Usually when you have a layer cake, there's frosting or filling in between the layers. And that separates each layer of government so that no one layer of government is interfering with the duties of another. But in real life, government does not work so seamlessly and so separately. So what we tend to think of when we tend to think of federalism, we tend to think of layer cake federalism, but really what happens is more of a marble cake. If you've ever made or eaten a marble cake, you'll know that the flavors are mixed together, that they're swirled into one another, and so there are multiple points of contact. And that is the more cooperative model that we live in. Problems are solved and sometimes created because the levels of government interact with one another in varying ways on different issues. So there's shared responsibility and constant interaction. There are 4 key elements of constitutional federalism. The first is in Article 6 of the Constitution, which is the Supremacy Clause. Quite simply, the Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Now, this may seem kind of contrary to what I've told you, that the states are quite powerful. But in terms of the supreme law of the land, that means that the Constitution is the supreme law where the Constitution speaks to something. And our Constitution is actually quite narrowly drawn in many instances. So this leaves a lot of room for states to work. The Necessary and Proper Clause is part of the Constitution's description of Congress's duties, but generally means that Congress and the federal government have the ability to do all of the things that are set out in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and anything necessary and proper to effectuate the rest. So if that means something like national security, military affairs, coining money, etc., It doesn't have to be specifically written down in the Constitution, but it must be necessary and proper to do what is written down. The Commerce Clause provides us with another federalism link. Generally, the federal government is only allowed to regulate interstate commerce, INTER, state commerce, whereas the states are left to regulate intra, INTRA, state commerce. And what that used to mean is that something that is created wholly within one state cannot be touched by the federal government and its regulations. But in part because of technology and in part because of the New Deal regulations, this changed drastically over time. And it got so large to the extent where in certain instances we were paying farmers not to farm. We still do that in farm subsidies. And even someone who may have only grown wheat or corn on his or her property for his or her own consumption or sale at a local farmer's market might still be engaging in interstate commerce because they have an effect on interstate commerce. So we will be talking to some degree about this institutional idea of interstate commerce and what that means for the states as they interact with each other and with the federal government throughout the semester. And then finally, the spending power. The federal government has the power to mint and coin money, but also to raise money and really the power to distribute money and spend money. So the spending power of Congress and the federal government is one tool by which the federal government can change policy within the states that it might not otherwise be entitled to do under the Constitution. So the areas of education, of housing, and a variety of ways are generally things that the federal government holds money out to the states and says, in order to take this money, you must do X, Y, and Z. And that X, Y, and Z is the regulatory effect that they want to have. They can't outright require that of states, but they can make it a condition of accepting funds. And the condition of accepting funds, they are able to set new policies and uniformly set policies from state to state. So the most famous of these is requiring states to raise their drinking age to 21 if they did not have a drinking age of 21 in order to receive certain federal funds. So why states? Well, to be quite honest, we didn't have to have states. The reason why we have states has to do largely with history and where we were at the time of our founding. But there are some ideological concerns when it comes to states and their role within our governmental apparatus. So first, you have to recall that we wanted to be free from a large government that was imposing its will from far away. As this was the type of thing that was, at the time, just recently fought off in the American Revolution, we didn't want to reinstitute it on ourselves. So there was a desire to be free from a large federal government, not only just to be free and live free from tyranny, but to be able to address local and state needs. But that fear of tyranny was always there, and the fear of tyranny meant, for many people, anytime a large government was involved. And they had just fought a revolution, and there was not a fervent desire to go through it again. There's also this idea that because states had been around prior to the revolution, that people were socialized into believing that states were necessities. There's nothing saying that Virginia is a necessity, or Pennsylvania is a necessity, or New York is a necessity. Where some subdivisions of government may be a necessity, those states in and of themselves, the boundaries of those states, in many ways, are arbitrary. There may be natural boundaries, but they don't always follow natural boundaries. And so people are socialized into believing that states must exist, and so they must continue existing. And this was true around the founding, and at this point, they have legal implications as well, and so it would be hard for states to merge, um, even if everybody was on board with the idea. And then, quite simply, money. States were fearful that the federal government would mismanage money and should not hold money, and that, quite frankly, holding money at a national level would disadvantage certain states and certain state interests. And so retaining the state structures was important for many people. Generally speaking, we can think of these spheres of responsibility in terms of what the federal and state governments do. I'm not going to focus so much on the federal side, which I do in many of my other classes, but on the state side. And the state side is a pretty robust set of responsibilities. State militias or National Guard units are controlled by the governor unless they are called into foreign service by the president. Intrastate commerce, and that isn't to say that even though we have some federal regulations on commerce, there can be additional state regulations on commerce, as well as any commerce that is exclusively within the state. State court systems. Most anyone's contact with our court systems is going to be with a state court, not a federal court, which comes to bear with that old phrase, don't make a federal case out of it, because a federal case is actually hard to make. Most of our interactions, if any, with court system is state courts, whether that be family law, marriage, divorce, adoption, etc. Criminal law, anything up to capital murder and anything down to jaywalking is most likely a state case. And everything in between. So our state court systems are usually our only or primary contact with the legal apparatus. States can borrow money, can levy taxes, certainly, but they cannot coin money or destroy what the federal government does in terms of monetary policy. In other words, the states can't tell the banks that are located within their jurisdictions that they can ignore federal guidelines. And the biggest of these things left to the states are safety and welfare. And that can be very narrow, like police, fire, etc. But it can include things like education, state roads, infrastructure that makes a state attractive and competitive. Because what we'll talk about throughout the semester is this idea that states want to compete for people to live within their boundaries. That this is no longer a case where people choose on the basis of necessarily wanting to be free from government, but maybe being included in government programs or in a culture of a certain kind. So that brings us to a few of our readings, and I'm not going to go over every single one of them, but I wanted to hit the highlights before we talk next week. The first of these is the two Federalist Papers I assigned, Federalist 17 and Federalist 45. And both take a view of the states as a key issue in whether the Constitution was ratified. So for those of you who are not familiar, or for those of you who have forgotten what the Federalist Papers' role in our society is, they were op-ed pieces written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and a few by John Jay, who is often forgotten because he didn't write any real important ones. But the Federalist Papers were timed releases of op-eds to coincide with the ratification of the Constitution and the ratification debates in various states. So after the Constitution was drafted, it went to the various states to approve it, and there were many people who wanted to either stick with the Articles of Confederation or wanted something in between. They didn't like the Constitution. They knew the articles weren't working, but they didn't think that they had to choose one or the other. And so the idea was that they had to convince at least 9 out of the 13 then states or colonies to former colonies to ratify the Constitution, to agree to its approval. And so the Federalist Papers are arguments in favor of this document that they were calling the Constitution. So Federalist 17 was written by Alexander Hamilton, and it addressed the fears that a federal government could encroach on states' rights. Many people were afraid that states would no longer be viable and would be reduced to mere arms of the federal government. And Hamilton argued against this in this rather short Federalist paper, but said that the federal government was not going to take over the states. And first he argued that the people would resist this because people have a connection to their state governments that they cannot possibly have with the federal government. People will resist any attempt by the federal government to take over the states. And if you think about it, we do have a large connection with our state governments. Our most interaction is with our state governments and with our local governments, which are arms of the state. And so he argued that the people themselves will resist this. And so electoral politics will sort this out. But he also says the Constitution provides a limited federal government. And so this limited federal government necessarily doesn't have what would be necessary to take over the state's authority. Finally, he argues that it would not serve the federal government to take over the role of the states. In other words, what would be the point? Why would the federal government want to do this? This argument might seem like the weakest in some respects, especially in our modern times, but there is an element to it that still rings true. While the federal government is larger than ever, it certainly does not impact everything we do. And the federal government is very picky on when it will get involved with states and how they function. We just happen to hear about those because they are pretty big issues. Things like same-sex marriage or marijuana legalization or criminal justice reform are hot topics and big issues, but that doesn't mean that the federal government's involvement with those issues makes it that much more powerful. There are plenty of things the federal government chooses not to get involved with because it would not benefit the federal government to do so. And so Hamilton is laying out an argument that not only does it not benefit the federal government to try and encroach on states' rights, that it simply could not happen. Now, this probably doesn't sound that convincing to those of us living in modern times, and rightfully so, because of everything the federal government has done since this was written that was not really contemplated. But our federal government is far more limited than the federal governments in other countries, and the interaction between the federal government and the state governments is not something you see in other countries, because the state governments have their own sovereign areas with which they are able to regulate or not regulate as they choose. And on the other side of this is Federalist 45. And this is written by James Madison and is the argument that the federal government is safe from the states. So in addition to having to argue that the federal government could not possibly encroach on states' authority, they also had to argue that the federal government is safe from states encroaching on their authority. And the reason why this is important is because people believed that a state or a powerful state, like let's say New York or Virginia, or a group of powerful states could get together and essentially take over the federal government in a way that did not benefit smaller states. And this argument that Madison lays out is that the states need the federal government, and the federal government is checked by the states. That the federal government is what ties it all together, but it certainly is not all-encompassing. It stresses that the power flows from the people to the federal government and the people to the states, so that in order for this fear to come true, you would need the power to go from the people to the states and then the states to the federal government. But that's not what happens. In reality, people choose their federal representatives and their state representatives because they have the power over both. And so he argues that states will be more powerful than the federal government in times of peace. But in times of war, it's more of a federally based system. That this is, in effect, a symbiotic relationship where power will shift over time, but that one side cannot take over the other. So that brings us to this discussion of what is different between all of these states. Because as we talk about these Federalist Papers, it's clear that things are different than our founders intended, and they are different between the states. So what makes living in different states so drastically different? The first is simply policy choices. Choices about what the state governments will regulate, will tax, how property is owned. These things go back sometimes hundreds, if not more. Sometimes they go back much further than that, and they're based on customs that we've had in civilization for much longer than hundreds of years. But policy choices about marriage. Only 11 states allow common law marriage, where if you live together for a certain period of time, you're considered married. That's a policy choice on the behalf of those states who have chosen to continue that practice or not continue it. Population and demographics. So first, more populated states have different needs and concerns than less populated states. Wyoming has different concerns than Michigan, and Montana has different concerns than California. But also demographics. Age differences are hugely important. We've heard a lot in recent times about different proposals for what to do with Medicare and how that would play out in a state like Florida, for example, with an aging demographic in certain areas. So the states respond to their demographics, and they also institute new programs to attract usually younger and more affluent demographics. And in some instances, younger, affluent, and white demographics as well, because race certainly plays into this. And so race, ethnicity, national origin all play into these demographics that change how states govern. Physicality and location. As Gray points out, this can do with natural resources. It can do with the physical location of the state and its proximity to other states. In other words, Michigan governs different than Arizona, and in part that is because of the natural resources available to us and our location within the country and within the world. So that this physicality cannot be ignored as a distinction in between states. And then major economic activities. This one is pretty easy to understand in a state like Michigan, where so much of our state economy has been tied to the auto industry for the past 100 years. And being so tied to one industry means that when that industry is on the brink of disaster, we need government intervention, or maybe feel we need government intervention in some cases, in order to keep that industry going. So, Gray also notes that there is an issue of political culture and breaks this down into three categories. One is an individualist culture where people see government as a interfering force and that markets will control for themselves, and so people should be allowed to do what they want. This is more of an individualist nature, and certain states have more of an individualist streak. Typically, Western states tend to be a bit more individualist. You'll see this a lot in Colorado and Wyoming and what have you, that people's right to do as they choose is usually valued over more civic-minded engagements. On the other end is this idea of a moralist political culture, where there is an idea of the greater good and programs to support that greater good. So examples of states like this would be like California and New York, where there are larger social programs to support different populations and different concerns. In many instances, Michigan used to be more of a moralist culture. Although we've had an individualist streak in certain things, we had a culture for many decades where we did things like pass the most expansive civil rights legislation or, in the country, or were the first Western democracy to outlaw the death penalty at a state level. So Michigan has an interesting history, as do all states, but it doesn't fall neatly within one of these camps, although one could argue a more individualist political culture has grown over time. And then there's a traditionalist culture, which kind of eschews both of these as somewhat antiquated. And so, where each state sits in terms of political culture, where its legislature sits, how its forces work, what interest groups are involved, are all relevant to the discussion alongside of policy choices, population, location, and economic activities. So, a few things to remember as we move forward. One, the states have power, but sometimes that power has to be exercised collectively to overcome federal power. Um, as we will see, especially with a new presidential administration, states that want to resist what the federal government is or is capable of doing might band together or come up with common strategies to do so. And that's because the federal government still is more powerful than any one state. People have, in many ways, sorted themselves out. One of the things that Gray touches on in her discussion of political culture is that people sort themselves out on these bases, that people's ideologies have solidified not because they live somewhere where people are changing their minds, but because they move to somewhere where people agree with them. History matters. The history of each state matters, and it shapes the laws of that state, and it shapes the ability to change policy course down the road. And one thing that we haven't touched on, because we're largely talking about the states, but is very important, is that local entities are the arms of the state. But states are not the arms of the federal government. States and the federal government are two wholly different entities. But local entities are arms of the state. They do not exist. They cannot act without authorization from the state to do so. And so the relationship is different. It's not a great comparison to say, well, the states are like states are to the federal government what localities are to states. It just doesn't work that way. And so it's important to remember that localities are very much a function of the state, but states are not very much a function of the federal government. So this is a broad set of reminders for our ongoing discussions throughout the semester.